started. So Christelle asked to talk about Jewish books. So I don't know what you meant, but what I wound up doing, which might not have been what you meant, but is definitely a very elucidating journey for all of us that can make it, is going through the whole development of rabbinic literature. Meaning understanding the whole process, because that's part of the process of how Torah was given over to us. So to go all the way back to the beginning, to not the beginning of creation, but to the giving of the Torah in the year 2448, approximately 2,500 years after creation, when God gave us the Torah, there was basically two separate categories. Now, please feel free to interrupt at any time with any questions, because I'm just going to download this whole class, a lot of information. So feel free, don't wait for me to pause. Just feel free to stop me or to send up a question through the chat. So God gave us what we call the written Torah and what we call the oral Torah. The written Torah means that part of Torah that was meant to be written down and was written down, which are the Torah, what maybe could be called the scriptures, which it consists of three branches, all of them God's words, but at different levels of spirituality. The most intense is the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, 5 books of Moshe, because every single word there is literally God's words, is literally different formations of names of God. There's so many levels of meaning embedded in those 5 books of Moses, which I don't know if you've heard of the concept of, they call it cracking the Torah codes, where they basically today put the Torah through computers, all the words, the whole text, and stopping at various points are finding like embedded in them levels and levels of prophecy of what will be, which from our perspective now already what was, all encoded in the Torah. It's a blueprint of creation. So all of creation is embedded in there. And it's a level of godliness that is such that we could sometimes say, well, why did God write it like this? He could have written it like this. But no, because it's not just for the storyline of what we need to understand. It's layers and layers and layers and layers deeper. A lower level part still of the written Torah is the books of the prophets. It's all prophecy, it's all divine, but we wouldn't put it on the same level as the 5 books of Moses, Torah, where every word is literally dictated by God. Now we have 2 categories we divide the prophets into, the early prophets and the later prophets. These are not, I want to clarify because this could be misunderstood, these are not the entire body of prophets of the Jewish people. The sages teach us that there were as many prophets as double the number of people that left with the Exodus. Meaning, if we're going to go with a conservative number of 600,000, because 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60 left with the Exodus, and if that's the number the sages are referring to, and not the total population of 3 million, but that's 600,000, that means there were 1,200,000 prophets. 1,200,000 prophets. We know of 48 prophets and of 7 prophetesses. I mean, 48 male prophets and 7 female prophets. So we know 55 prophets. There were 1,200,000 prophets. But we don't know about them because a prophet could have prophecy that's just for himself. Or a prophet could have prophecy for a very specific other individual. Or even a prophet could have a prophecy for the entire people, but it was just for that time. The only prophecies that were written down were those prophecies that are for all generations. And that's why we know of 55 prophets, and there were over 1 million. But the ones we know of are the ones that are relevant for us to know their prophecies. And all the others, they could have been very, very powerful prophets that really helped the people. but we don't know about them because they're not relevant for our times, only for those times. So the early prophets, the books of the early prophets are 4 books: Joshua, Yoshua, Shoftim, the Judges, Shmuel, Samuel, and Malach and Kings. Those are the early prophets, and the later prophets are Yeshaya, Isaiah, Yirmiyah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and then 12 additional prophets of Hosea, Yoel, Amos, Obadiah, Yonah, Micha, Nahum, Habakkuk, Tzfanya, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are the prophets who merited to have their prophecy written down, which doesn't mean they were even, it's because these are the prophets for all generation. And those are the books called the prophets. Then we have a third part of the written Torah, which is called the Kesuvim. We have Torah, the 5 books. We have Nevi'im, the prophets, which we just enumerated, the early and the later prophets. And then we have the writings, the Kesuvim. This is also written with a divine spirit, but a little bit less than the level of prophecy in the prophets. So the ultimate level is Torah, the 5 books. That's God's words dictated. Then a bit lower, the prophets, and then a little bit lower than that, the writings. And there are 12, but also very, very, very godly all of them. There are 12 books of writings: Rus, Psalms, Eov, in English as Job, Mishlei, Koheles, Shir Hashirim, Song of Songs, Eicha, Lamentations, Daniel, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Hayamim, which I think translates to Chronicles. So these are the books of the writings, and that's it. We're done the written Torah. So we have the Torah, we have the prophets, we have the writings, and that together, all of those works together are the written Torah. Is that all that Moses received on Mount Sinai? No. He received a tremendous amount more. But all of that was called the oral Torah. Oral Torah was everything else God taught us. God sent Moses, that Moses taught the people. But it was called the oral Torah because originally it was not allowed to be transcribed. Meaning if you were a student and you were studying at your teacher's feet, you could write for yourself little brief notes just to jog your memory. But that was it. And that's why people studied so assiduously. The great sage Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, descendant of converts, one of the greatest sages of all times, he studied 24 years straight. So that was a bit more than usual, 24 years straight. But to study for years was normal. Because every single person, in essence, had to be a walking Torah scroll. Every person had to contain himself all of the Torah because there was no books for reference. Forget about no phones for reference, no Google for reference. There were no books for reference. There were no scrolls for reference. Besides the 5 books of Torah, the prophets, and the writings, nothing else was committed to writing. It was all in your mind. It says in the times of the Talmud, it was the norm for an average student to review everything he learned 100 times. That was normal. There wasn't anything special. That was just the norm because 100 times, I mean, if my students reviewed something 4 times, they would consider themselves over the top, beyond crazy. 100 times because they literally contained everything in their mind. It was in their mind, everything. So what happened? We have a lot of books nowadays. How do we get all these books when we're told it wasn't supposed to be written down, and the only thing that was supposed to be written down was the scriptures, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings? Where did everything else come up from? So what happened was, after the destruction of the Second Temple, was a very harsh time for the Jewish people. It got worse, but it was the beginning of an incredibly harsh time. Very, very bleak. Enormous poverty, enormous oppression. This was when the Romans were controlling us, and they got worse, and then they became Christian. They became even more fanatically oppressive. But even in the beginning, they were quite bad. And there was a fear that the oral Torah will be forgotten. Meaning, a person, as I said, you review something 100 times, you're walking Torah, everything is committed in your mind, you spend years and years and years studying. People didn't have that luxury. Life was so hard and so pressured, and it was so fraught with tensions, and the Romans kept making decrees prohibiting this and preventing this, and they kept attacking Judaism, that who knows what's going to be. It seemed that Torah would be forgotten because people wouldn't have had the ability to just sit calmly and take it all in. And therefore, the leader of that generation, who's known as Judah the Prince, in Hebrew, he's called Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince. He said, God, for your sake, we have to write down the Torah. You said don't write it down because it's so holy. It shouldn't come down to physicality, pen, paper, ink, parchment. But guess what? If we don't do that, we're going to lose it. He quoted a verse in Psalms that it's a time to do for God there because they're abolishing your Torah. So we've got to do this and write it down because otherwise we're not going to have it at all. So this was approximately the year 200 of the Common Era. And this was for the first time that they were committing to writing the oral Torah. Previously, several generations previous, about 400 some years before, they had already sort of created a certain structure and format, but it was all oral communication. Now we're going to take that and put it in writing. So they knew they had to put it in writing. They knew God didn't really want it in writing. So what they did was they wrote it very, very cryptically. They wrote it very, very briefly, just like notes to jog your memory, just the most bottom line facts from which you're supposed to remember pages and pages and pages, so to speak, that you retained in your brain because they're not written anywhere. And that writing is called the Mishnah. If you've ever heard the term Mishnah, that is the foundational work of recording the law, how to live a godly life, how to fulfill the commandments. I mean, the Torah tells us the 613 commandments, but doesn't tell us how to do them. So the Mishnah is telling us how to do them very, very briefly. And again, we ascribe as the, if you will, the author, Judah the Prince, but of course he didn't do it alone. It was with all the sages of the time. He was leading them. He was the physical and spiritual leader of his time. This is roughly the year 200. He codified all the laws into 6 sections. And those are the 6 sections of the Mishnah, and they are studied until this day. They're studied by children, they're studied by scholars, there's many, many, many commentaries on them, and in essence, the whole Talmud, in fact, I'll take a question in a second, Talmud is all really created to explain the Mishnah, as we'll speak, that people couldn't understand anymore, so then we have Talmud. Becca, what's your question?
Yeah, okay, so you mentioned the Mishnah and about Judah the Prince, but I heard about the Mishnah Torah, which I thought...
That's Maimonides.
Maimonides. Yeah, so it's the Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah is 2 different things.
Maimonides lived about 800 years ago. The Mishnah was written almost 2,000 years ago, about 1700 some years ago. So it's predating Maimonides by approximately 1,000 years. The Mishnah is the oldest work post-biblical of rabbinic literature. It is the original work that the rabbis committed to writing, parchment and quill. They committed to writing down the law. Mishnah Torah is called that for a different reason. It's called Mishnah there means second to, like the word in Hebrew for two is sheni, shnei. So it's the same etymology, Mishnah Torah, meaning Maimonides wrote in the introduction, I'm calling this Mishnah Torah because basically you need a Bible, as we say, a Jewish Bible, and this work, and you're done. You're good to go. Everything you need to know about being a Jew is all recorded here, as well as being a Noahide. Because he does discuss Noahides, of course. But we'll get to him. We will definitely speak about that work in a bit. But this is the first work, Mishnah. The idea here, Mishnah, is the idea of to repeat, shinun, repetition, learning, study. That's why it's called Mishnah.
Okay,
Any other
thank you.
questions so far? Thanks for that good question. Any other questions so far? So at this same time, now the Mishnah was the first thing. But once Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, once Judah the Prince wrote this down, it sort of opened the door that a few other things got written down in close proximity. So very shortly after, we will call it roughly the same time, the foundational work of esoteric thought called the Zohar was authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Those of you that heard of the tragedy in Meron this year, I'm sure many of you heard of it because it was so horrific. So that tragedy took place at the gravesite of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And the reason there were so many Jews there is that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a very, very great sage, probably assumed to be the greatest Kabbalist of all times, forever. And when he passed away, he said, I'm so excited. I'm going to my wedding because now God and I will truly fuse and become one. And I want you all to celebrate this day. This is a happy day for me. This should be a happy day for you. This is a blessed day for me. This will be a blessed day for you. So since then, and we're talking about roughly 1900 years ago, Jews would flock to the burial site of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, called Meron, on the day of his passing, the 18th of the Jewish month of Iyar, roughly a month after, 3 weeks after Passover, roughly. And that's why there were so many Jews, because there's always, I mean, this year there weren't as many Jews as there usually are because of Corona. Usually, easy, there's like 100,000 people that come to celebrate with Reb Shimon Bar Yochai on the day of his passing. So he authored the most fundamental work on the esoteric dimension of Torah, on what we call Kabbalah, and it is called the Zohar. It's called the Zohar, to answer what Becca might be wondering, because Zohar means like a light, a shining light, a luminous light. And this was the shining, shining light of the inner dimension of Torah, God's inner thoughts, inner will, inner wisdom, that he was committing to paper, to parchment. Also here is not only his work, others, as we can see, it's sort of a compilation. It's primarily attributed to Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, but others also participated. It was actually missing for about 1,000 years. We knew he wrote this work. See, what happened was, to give a little more background to understand this, until the generation of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, almost nobody knew about or studied the esoteric dimension, what we call Kabbalah. It was very, very, very holy, and for very, very few, very, very holy people. And that's how it was from Moses on. He passed it on to a few people covertly, who passed on to a few people covertly, who passed on to a few people covertly. And that's how it went in a very, very, very covert line until the time of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, until the generation post the destruction of the Second Temple. Because as I mentioned before, the same reason the Mishnah was written down, it was a very horrible, harsh, oppressive time. The Romans were a very, very, very oppressive regime on the Jewish people. I'm saying it only got worse. And here already it was very, very, very harsh. And because they were so devastated by the destruction of the temple and by the harshness of what followed, meaning the Babylonians, some almost 500 years before, roughly 500 years before, destroyed the first temple. And they took us all into captivity. But after that, they were nice to us. So we recovered. The Romans destroyed the temple and continued being absolutely brutal to us for the duration of their regime. They were absolutely brutal and just got worse and worse and worse and worse. So this generation post the destruction of the temple were so, we'd use the word traumatized, were so hurt and harmed by everything the Romans were doing, that God sort of gave the green light that everyone should study the inner dimension of Torah, meaning it's the most powerful part of Torah. So as such, for this generation exclusively, we have to let everyone have it as like the balm for their soul to keep going. Does someone have a question? I don't know if someone's just unmuted or someone has a question. Someone have a question for me? Anyone have a question for me? Okay. So therefore, after this one, so this generation, Rishon Bar Yochai, he taught Kabbalah, the esoteric dimension, publicly. The people of his generation knew it for just one generation, and then it was like closed up. We're back to secret passing of these esoteric secrets of God. And as part of that, the Zohar was, so to speak, lost because the world wasn't privy for it. And about 1,000 years later, it was found by a Spanish Kabbalist, Moshe de Leon, in the 13th century, meaning the 1200s. So from about the year 200 until the 1200s, it was gone from us. And then it resurfaced. Then at that point, the world was allowed to benefit from it. So we're saying from Moses until about the year 200, none of this oral Torah is written down. In the year 200, because of the oppression, the Mishnah is written down, the first codification of Jewish law. Very right after that, the Zohar is written down, the writing down of the esoteric dimension, the inner dimension of God's secrets. And there was something else that also shortly after this was written down, which are called midrash, midrashim, or they might be called agadita, if you've heard any of those terms. Midrash means, well, there's two types of midrash. There's what's called narrative midrash, midrash agada. Agada means narration. The narrative midrash, which sort of like fills in the storyline in all the biblical writings, meaning in the Torah and in the prophets and in the writings, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, and all of them, a lot of details are filled in, that stuff we don't know, but it's all written in the midrash. There's also called midrash halacha, the legal midrash, which is legally learning out the law and clarifying the law from the biblical text. So we have two different types of works. They're both called midrash. Midrash is to seek out. That's the root word, lidrosh, to seek, to investigate, to explicate, to pull out. So we have all the narrative midrash, which are all the stories. Most of the biblical stories we know are not written in the scriptures. We know them from the midrash. And there's the legal midrash, which is the evolution, the showing how the law is derived from the verses of the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses. So the legal midrash was written down in 3 works called the Mechilta, Sifra, and Sifri. They're compiled around the 3rd century. So again, around the same time as the Mishnah is being compiled, around the same time as the Zohar is being compiled, these legal midrashim, these works that go verse by verse and pull them apart, and all the rabbis are pulling them apart to extract the law, that's the legal midrashim, just a little bit after the writing of the Mishnah. It's very similar to the Mishnah, meaning the Mishnah is giving the law, and Mechilta, Sifra, and Sifri, the legal midrashim, are also giving the law, but very different style, because the Mishnah, as I said, is very, very, very cryptic. It's just giving like the what of the law. But the legal midrashim, as written in, compiled in Sifra, Sifri, and Mechilta, give the why. And it really shows you how laws are derived from the precision of wording of the verses of the Torah. That from the very precise wording, it says here in this verse like this, and here like this, or in the verses, the tremendous, tremendous nuances of the verses comes forth the laws. Becca?
Okay, so then what is the Talmud?
The Talmud hasn't happened yet. So once we get to the Talmud, I'll tell you. But we're going to get to it soon. You know, it's interesting you said that either you read my mind or I read yours, because as I was saying it, I'm like, this sounds a lot like the Talmud, the way I'm explaining it. The difference, I mean, so let me answer that question if you were sort of wondering that it sounds like the Talmud. I'm not talking about the Talmud here. This is the Midrash. The Talmud is the sages, the argumentation of the sages in resolving what is the law. In the Talmud, the sages of the Talmud will quote verses to refute or defend their positions. In the Midrash, we're not having argumentation here. The purpose of the verses is deriving the law. So it's not argumentation. It's saying, oh, there's this extra word here. Because of that, da, 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 da. Oh, there's a letter missing here. The reason the letter is missing is because da, 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 da. So it's like going through the verses with a fine-tooth comb and pulling out all the laws, the oral Torah, embedded in the verses, embedded in the written Torah. This was a few hundred years before the time of the Talmud. The time of the Talmud already was a little more obscured. So we are more like arguing, so to speak. I mean, not in a negative way, but we are like analyzing, is this the law or is this the law? In the Midrash, they're not debating. They're not refuting. They're just pulling it out, if that clarified.
So the Talmud is not necessarily the oral Torah.
It is the oral Torah.
It is the oral Torah, but so is the Mishnah.
It's all the oral Torah. Everything, I guess that wasn't clear. Thank you for asking. Everything of Torah that's not the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings is all the oral Torah.
Okay, got it.
All of this was given to Moses. All of this was passed on orally through the generations, and bit by bit, it got written down. So the Mishnah is the first writing, then we have the Zohar, then we have the Midrash Halacha, the legal Midrashim. All of these are the first writing down of the oral Torah.
Gotcha.
It's going to continue. We're going to get the Talmud. It's going to go a lot further than that. All of this is making it more and more user-friendly as people's minds and hearts got smaller and smaller and smaller. So I mean, Danielle knows all the books in my house, or at least in the living room she's seen, and that's just a little piece of what's in my house. All of that's the oral Torah, and all of that people knew in their brains. And now we have this all written down because our brains are quite small and we wouldn't be able to know it. So that's why we have it written down. So that is the Midrash, the legal Midrash. So again, the legal Midrash is very different than the Mishnah because the Mishnah is very cryptic. It just says bottom line. And the legal Midrash is really explicating and really explaining. The sages are saying how they're deriving it. So it's a lot longer. It might say the exact same thing bottom line, that shows you the whole process. There's also what Midrash is more known for is not the legal Midrash, but the Agadita. Agadita meaning the storyline. These were compiled over a period of 800 years. That doesn't mean that over the period of 800 years is when people first found out about them. Again, this was all given to Moses on Sinai, but they started writing them down once Judah the prince said, we got to write this stuff down, right? He said, we got to write it down. He compiled the Mishnah. Concurrently, a little bit after him, the sages compiled the legal Midrash. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is compiling the esoteric dimension, the Zohar. And then sages are writing down all of the storylines that people have known since Moses was on Sinai, but were never written down. This took place over centuries, meaning the Mishnah was written down over, I don't know, a few years, as was the Zohar, very short time, the Zohar for sure. Also, the legal Midrashim, I don't know, it took a year, 2 years, 3 years, a few years, it was all written down. This took place over a period of about 800 years. So over a period of 800 years, all of what most people view as the Midrashim, because this is the much more famous part of Midrash, and this is much more well-known. This is all the stories. All of the stories we know. Stories you were taught as Bible stories in the church. Lahavdil, 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 it's all coming from this Midrash, which was recorded from the year 200 to the year 1000. Again, it was all explained prior. It was all received by Moses on Mount Sinai, and he taught it to his generation, who taught it to the next generation, who taught it to the next generation, who taught it to the next generation. But Judah the prince said, we got to write it down. If we don't write it down, it will get lost. So this is interpreting the Torah, exploring a lot of ethical, moral questions. There's a lot of theology in it. There's a lot of parables. It's filling in the missing storyline. All the books of the written Torah, meaning all the 5 books of Moses and the prophets and the writings, all have midrash that explain them. So it's almost impossible to learn any of the written Torah without this Agadita midrash, which means like the storyline midrash. The legal midrash, you could not learn, whatever. Just tell me the bottom line what I got to do. I don't need to learn it. But everyone has to know, and everyone does know, the storyline midrash, because that's how you understand what the written Torah is telling us. Now, again, when I say everyone knows it, that doesn't mean everyone knows all of it. There's so much, but everyone knows bits and pieces of it because it gives the flavor, it gives the understanding, it gives the story of what was going on that we see very cryptically in the verses. Everything here, the Mishnah, the Zohar, the legal midrash, the story midrash, all of these were written with what we call Ruach HaKodesh, which means the divine spirit. None of this was viewed as very religious individuals or very wise individuals are sharing with us their insight. All of the writings, every religious writing, not just these, the writing started in the year 200, from the writings of the Mishnah that was in the year 200 until the 1660s, 1663, 1400 years later, all of those writings were with the divine spirit. That doesn't mean writings afterwards weren't, but every writing until then I know was. 1663, when I'm giving that date as a cutoff, was the passing of a very, very, very influential halachic meaning legal commentary. There were two very, very famous commentaries that we'll touch on if we finish this today, otherwise next time. They were called the Taz and the Shach. The Shach passed away in 1663. They were the two most influential commentaries on law from that era. They were contemporaries. The Taz and the Shach were contemporaries. The Taz and the Shach both explained law, and they are considered the most influential commentaries on law, meaning anyone that's studying law studies it with the Taz and the Shach. And the Shach passed away in 1663. And we are told that all Torah writings from the first writing of the Mishnah all the way through 1663 with the Taz and the Shach, they were all done with the divine spirit. It doesn't mean that they didn't use their minds. Obviously, they're using their minds. But what came through their minds was God's word, was pure divine spirit. And therefore, everything we learn, Becca said, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Zohar, any of the writings, everything we're going to speak about today was prior to the Taz and the Shach. So anything I mentioned today, we view every single word of all of those writings as absolutely holy, godly information. Meaning it's coming from God, it's divine spirit. If it came from a mind of a man, a very intelligent man, a very religious man, but a human, I agree, I disagree. I could disagree with someone who's smarter than me. I could disagree with someone who's more religious than me. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. We don't view any of these writings this way. There's no concept of disagreeing. All of it is godliness. All of it is the will of God. All of it is divine spirit. Post 1663, obviously some things were also coming with divine spirit, but not everything. It's not a guarantee. But until 1663, until the passing of the Taz and the Shach, we're guaranteed. Human minds worked, but what came through those human minds was God's will, was the divine spirit. All their writings were illuminated by God's vision. And that's why every word of the Talmud, including all the argumentation in the Talmud, is holy. It doesn't make a difference that they're arguing. They're arguing, but for us, it's all the divine spirit. So every word there we treasure, every word there we view as a holy expression of God's will and God's wisdom. As we view all of the writings for that 1400 some year era from the year 200 until the year 1663. And again, it's not saying after 1663, it was no longer divine spirit, but then it could be more of a combination of human intellect sparked by divine spirit. Or even some things could just be purely human intellect and not with divine spirit. Christelle mentioned the Tanya in her question that caused this class to be. So the Tanya we view as a combination of the intellect of the author with the divine spirit. And other works we'd say are just human, very good or not, profound or not divine, human intellect. But everything till 1663 was divine. Any questions on any of this? Okay, so we're saying they began writing down the oral law. It was all given to Moses at Sinai, and it was never written down until the year 200 with the Mishnah, the basic, most cryptic cliff notes on the law, the Zohar, the writing down of the Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic esoteric, the legal Agada, and then for about 600 years, the narrative Agada. From the year 200 till the year 800, stretching out the narrative Agada. The Mishnah's closed. Closing means we're done. Going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah was structured with 6 sections. And then the rabbis of the Mishnah are called the Tanaim. And after the Mishnah's closed, Judah the prince said, okay, we're done. We have our 6 sections. We are closed. This is the Mishnah. Not one letter can be added. We are done. It's closed. The book is sealed. But the rabbis still had more to say, but the book was sealed. So the same rabbis called Tanaim compiled 2 works that are called post-Mishnah, meaning the Mishnah is sealed, but the rabbis of the Mishnah still have things to say. So some are called Brisa. Brisa literally means outside because it was outside the Mishnah. And also the work after the Brisa was called Tosefta. So Brisa and Tosefta are the same rabbis of the Mishnah called Tanaim, but the Mishnah is closed. Judah the prince said, we're done. Oh, I forgot to say this. We're done. What do we do? Write something else. So first they wrote something else very similar to the Mishnah called Brisa, and then that was done. But we're not done yet. We still got more to write. They wrote something else after that called Tosefta. Tosefta means like, Brisa means it's outside the Mishnah, and Tosefta means it's an addition. It's an addition to the Mishnah. Same rabbis, same voices, same names in the Mishnah, in the Brisa, and the Tosefta. It's all the same people, but like we're done the Mishnah, but we still want to keep talking. So with all of this writing, with the Mishnah, plus the Brisa and the Tosefta, plus the Zohar, plus the Agadas, the Midrash that was being written down, the legal Midrash, the storyline Midrash, Judaism continued until it became too difficult for people to understand. Because again, remember I said the Mishnah is sort of like Cliff Notes. It's written very, very briefly because we got to write it, but we're not supposed to write it. We feel bad writing it, but we have to write it. So the compromise of those 2 sides is write it very briefly. So Mishnah says bottom line law, and it doesn't say a lot more than it does say. So how do you do everything else? You're supposed to remember it. Well, they started to forget. They couldn't do it anymore. Their minds got smaller, exile got harsher, they couldn't do it. And the continued chaos, the continued pressures, people weren't spending 24 years learning, they weren't reviewing everything as much as they should have, though they were still reviewing it a lot of times at the Talmud, they're still reviewing it 100 times. But they just couldn't do it anymore. They didn't understand the Mishnah. So the rabbis of that time said, we got to clarify the Mishnah. So the rabbis that clarified the Mishnah is called the Gemara. Talmud. The Talmud means Mishnah plus Gemara. Now you could have 3 lines of Mishnah and like then 150 pages of Gemara, clarifying and exculpating from and going on a tangent, so to speak, seemingly, and arguing and connecting and elucidating 150 pages from those 3 lines. And all of it's holy, all of it's divine spirit. And the Mishnah plus the Gemara is what we call the Talmud. There are actually 2 Talmuds. There's the Talmud that was written in Jerusalem and the Talmud that was written in Babylonia. Generally today, if people speak about the Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is much shorter, much briefer, with much less argumentation. And the Babylonian Talmud is much longer, much more developed, with much more argumentation. Now, the simple way of understanding the difference is because the Jerusalem Talmud was written in Jerusalem. And it was very, very harsh in Jerusalem. This is, again, we're talking here about the end of the 4th, the beginning of the 5th century. So the end of the 4th century, talking, about the year 400, right? About the year 400, about 200 years after the Mishnah. So over those 200 years, look how fast they fell. Meaning in the year 200, the Mishnah was written. Oh my gosh, we have something written. This is so exciting. Whoa, I can read these pages. Now I'll remember everything because I read a line and it reminds me of like 20 hours of lecture. Well, 200 years later, they read a line and they were like, huh? I'm not sure what it means. I don't remember the 20 hours of lecture this line is supposed to jog in my mind. That was 200 years later. Look how fast the generation fell. But it was a really harsh time, especially in Israel. Most of world Jewry was not in Israel at this time because it was just too untenable with the Romans. The Romans were really harsh and vicious. And of course, now it's already the Christian era. The Romans were very, very harsh to the Jews. So there were very few Jews left in Israel, meaning the Romans killed a lot. The Romans took as slaves a lot. And the ones they didn't kill and didn't take as slaves were barely surviving. They were completely impoverished, completely under this harsh, harsh regime. So where the Jews were flourishing at that time was in Babylonia. If you know your history to know why the Jews were in Babylonia, as I mentioned earlier, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonian king. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. When he destroyed the first temple, he took the bulk of the Jews into exile in Babylonia. They were in exile there for 70 years. When he first, obviously the destruction of the temple was very harsh and the march into exile was very harsh. Once we got to Babylonia, they were nice to us. The Babylonians liked us. They said, oh, you're a Semitic people. We're a Semitic people. It's a great land. Welcome, enjoy. So, there were obviously some brief periods of oppression, but overall it was 70 easy years, relatively speaking. So when the Jews were given permission by Cyrus to go back to Israel, the majority of the Jews didn't leave Babylonia. It was too comfortable and good there, and Israel was too scary. Now, obviously, Jews did go back, and we have all the history of the Jews building the Second Temple and everything that happened. But throughout that whole Second Temple era, there's a large Jewish contingency in Babylonia. Once the Second Temple is destroyed, obviously, hordes of Jews are murdered, hordes of Jews are taken slaves, and some are barely surviving, and some leave and go to Babylonia, where there was respite, where the Babylonian kings were much more benign. They weren't Christian, and they were much more accepting of the Jews. They were tolerant of the Jews. They allowed the Jews to practice their faith. They allowed the Jews to have economic security. So for the Jews that were barely holding on in Israel, Babylonia was like, whoa, the promised land, so to speak, in terms of physical and financial security. But still, Jews clung to Israel because they knew that was a holy place. That was God's holy land. And even rabbis from Babylonia went to Israel knowing it's the holiest place, and it's the best place to study God's work is in his land and in Israel. So it was hard there, but there were still Jews that clung there as long as they could. So the Talmud written in Jerusalem, again, about 200 years after the Mishnah, at this point, there's not that many Jews in Israel, and it's very harsh. And that's how some explain why it's so much shorter. They didn't have the luxury of being able to debate and talk and discuss and do this over a long time. They just sort of recorded it and were done. In Babylonia, it was much easier. There was financial security, there was political security, and the rabbis over hundreds of years could develop the Talmud as they did in Babylonia. So most people, when they say they're studying the Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. It's not that people don't study the Jerusalem Talmud, but it's much more focused on the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was completed around the end of the 4th century. So we might roughly say around the year 400, beginning of the 5th century. The Babylonian Talmud was completed about 100 years later. So they took 100 more years to write their Talmud. They both started at the same time, but the Jerusalem finished fairly quickly, and the Babylonian extended over 100 years. The rabbis of the Talmud are called Amoraim. And so I'm saying from a very simple perspective, people more focus on the Babylonian Talmud as much more complex and developed. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that actually the Jerusalem Talmud is holier. And the reason why the Jerusalem Talmud is so much shorter than the Babylonian Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, there's a lot of argumentation. Everything is discussed, everything is debated, everything is refuted, everything has to be proved. In the Jerusalem Talmud, they more just say it and move on. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says the reason is because they were in Jerusalem. They were in a holier place. So they were in the light. They saw it clearly. They knew the law. They saw the law. They weren't groping in the dark to find it. So they just said it. The back and forth argumentation of the Babylonian Talmud is because they were in Babylonia. They were outside Israel. So they were in a place of darkness. So when it's dark, you group and group and group to find the object. They're grouping and grouping, and that's why they're all the back and forth argumentation and dissertation of the verses and proving and counter-proving is all to find the light, which was harder to find because they were in a dark place. On the other hand, when you're in the dark and you finally find the light, it's a light coming from darkness, which is a very great light. So that's why the Jerusalem Talmud is briefer, because they just saw the light and said it. They saw God's will, they saw the law, and they said it. And the Babylonian Talmud needs a lot more to come to the light, but the light that's emerging is an even greater light because it's light from darkness. And light from darkness is a greater light. And most scholarly rabbinic pursuit comes from studying the Talmud, because the Talmud is quite analytical and it's something you could put your mind into for forever, because there's just more and more and more and more and more from there. Okay, any questions? I'm taking a question break because nobody asked me any questions. I'm putting a lot of information on you. Any questions? All right. So after the Talmud, we have the rabbis of the Talmud are called the Amoraim. After the Talmud was closed, we're saying about the year 500. Now we're going to be in the 6th century, right, in the 500s. And the writings then were done by the next group of rabbis that are called the Sivuraim, which were basically from the year 500 to 600. And they worked on the Talmud, meaning the Talmud was written. These are not the rabbis whose names are in the Talmud. The rabbis whose names are in the Talmud finished by the year 500. But from 500 to 600, the next century, the next group of rabbis structured the Talmud. They gave it its current structure, its current form. So they worked on the Talmud for another 100 years, right? We said the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud was 100 years more than the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was like basically the year 400 done. The Babylonian Talmud took another 100 years. And then 100 years after that, the rabbis in Babylonia, again, they have the economic and political security to be able to do this, are working and refining and compiling the Talmud, basically making it the Talmud as we know it today. After them, the rabbis after them are called the Geonim, which is basically they're viewed from like 589, the end of the 6th century, until about 1038 is the passing of the last one of the rabbis we call the Geonim. So basically, if you want to be a little rougher and smoother, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the people that are spoken of in the Mishnah, whose voices we hear in the Mishnah, the Tanaim, are from basically the years 0 to 200. The Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, of the Gemara, live from about 200 to 500, meaning rabbis could be in the Talmud who passed away 100 years before the Talmud was written, but their students record their teachings. So the rabbis of the Talmud, of the Gemara, are from the year 200 to 500. The Sforaim are 500 to 600, and the Geonim from 600 to a little after 1,000, 1038. That was all the rabbinic literature of that time, which again, really was the first time that we have rabbinic literature. After this, after the Geonim, again, from roughly 1070 until 1500, those rabbis we call the Rishonim, which are called meaning the first rabbis. And from 1500 until today, we're called the Acharonim, the later rabbis. This is all the development of the law and the study of the law. And so what happened was, again, let's understand this historically. Until the year 200, people learned. They studied by the feet of their teacher. They absorbed. They reviewed it themselves 100 so times. They knew it. They became the teachers and taught to their students, who reviewed it 100 so times and knew it. And this system worked for generations. It worked from the giving of the Torah until, it worked for roughly, I'm saying very roughly now, just thinking of how many years it was. Worked for about 1,400 years, roughly. And then we just couldn't do it anymore. Exile was too harsh. So then the Mishnah was written down. And then 200 some years later, we're like, we don't understand this anymore. So when the Gemara is written down, the Talmud is created. And then we have the Sforaim and the Gaonim that are helping us understand, clarifying, elucidating, pulling together the Talmud. And that's how Jews lived. Meaning, how do I live as a Jew? How do I know how to serve God? Well, until the Mishnah was written down, you knew because you studied, it was all in your brain. And then when the Mishnah was written down, you studied, it was in your brain, and the Mishnah helped clarify. And then you're like, I can't learn this from the Mishnah. So we have folios and folios and folios of the Talmud. Now you're going to know how to live as a Jew. You're going to open up a Talmud and know how to live as a Jew. You're going to know the law. You're going to know what God wants from you. Needless to say, the Talmud is quite cumbersome. If anyone's ever seen a Talmud, it's volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes. Imagine wondering, what do I do if I forgot to say this prayer? Oh, look it up in the Talmud. What do I do if I'm not sure if my chicken's kosher or not? Oh, look it up in the Talmud. What blessing do you make on this food? Look it up in the Talmud. The Talmud is so much argumentation, so much discussion, so many, so to speak, tangential roads we're going. To find the law and all that, you need a brilliant, brilliant mind that soon the people didn't have anymore. Meaning the times of the Talmud, oh my gosh, this is amazing. From those little cryptic lines of Mishnah, now it's all clear. But then as the generations fell, it's like the Talmud, clear? I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's brilliant, but clear, the clear law didn't seem so for the people because the exile was harsh and people's minds got smaller and smaller. I mean, we're at the end of the road. Our minds are like teeny. But people's minds got smaller and smaller and smaller. And they didn't have the knowledge to be able to understand the law from the Talmud. They needed, as we would call it, something more user-friendly. So 3 very, very great rabbis, each one independently, didn't work together, created basically what I'm going to call a user-friendly version of the Talmud. Each of their works is very different. Each one impacted Jewish thought and Jewish law till today. Each of them are credited with really trying to do this. Each one tried to do the same thing in a different way. How do I take the law of the Talmud and make it something accessible to common man? So if he forgot to make a blessing, he knows how to find the answer. And if he's not sure if you're allowed or not allowed to do this on the Sabbath, he knows how to find an answer. It'd be pretty hard for us to find that from the Talmud. I mean, for us, it would be impossible. The first one is known as the Rith. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. He lived from 1013 to 1103. He was a Talmudist. He determined law, and he was the first one. His book is called Sefer HaHalachot, which means the book of laws. And he basically went through the entire Talmud. He followed the structure of the Talmud. He went through the entire Talmud, and he pulled out from pages of discussion, pages of Agadita, pages of argumentation, he pulled out the laws. He was the first one to do so. The second one to do so is who Becca mentioned earlier, Maimonides. Maimonides did so in Mishnah Torah. Maimonides lived from 1135, or some say from 1138 until 1204. And he had the exact same goal. He did it different than the Rif, who preceded him, and the one who followed him. He is for sure the foremost intellectual figure of medieval Judaism. He was a legal codifier. He wrote philosophy. He also on the side was a leading physician of his times, was a physician of the Sultan of Egypt. But he was a leader. He was a leader. He was probably the Rebbe, the leader. I'm sure he was, no question. The leader of world Jewry of his generation, spiritually nurturing Jews and non-Jews in the entire world. So he was the most brilliant mind. He was, when you study his works, you're just awed by his brilliance. It shines through every page. Sharp, brilliant mind. So what he did, let me just finish, I'm going to take a question back in. He culled all the laws from the Talmud. But unlike the Rif, who wrote them like in the order of the Talmud, he created a whole new structure, like the most, as we would call it, user-friendly. I'm taking all these laws, but now I'm going to organize them according to topics. Because the Talmud is officially according to topics. But you can find laws about everything everywhere. Because they can go on discussions. Oh, that reminds me. And the same teacher that you're quoting that taught this, he taught us that also. It's about a different topic, but don't worry. And oh, that teacher taught you that? I remember that teacher teaching me this about this. That's like a page of Talmud. So it's like, whoa, you're flying through hundreds of years and lots of different topics. Maimonides say, no, we want to make this simple. We want to make this user-friendly. So we're sticking to one topic. So we're not following the structure of the Talmud. We are taking it topic by topic, and we are pulling from the entire Talmud everything the Talmud says on this topic before the computer. Everything the Talmud says on this topic. And that is how he wrote his monumental work, which he called, as Becca said before, Mishnah Torah. Mishnah here meaning second to the Torah. Because he writes in his introduction, have a Torah, have Mishnah Torah, and you're good to go. Everything you need to know to serve God is all written in these 14-volume work. Becca, what was your question?
Okay, so this reminded me of it. I read a book to my husband, and it mentioned a Native American group or maybe a Native Mexican group called Chumash. And I thought, Chumash, it was spelled Chumash. Chumash, I've heard that before. There's a book of Hebrew called the Chumash. Chumash.
The Chumash is the Torah. The Chumash is the colloquial, more if you want to use the word, I don't know, colloquial. It's a word for the 5 books of Moses. They're called the Chumashim, Chumash. So it's spelled the same way, but in the Hebrew, CH is guttural. So it's, so Chumash, yes. And that's the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 5 books, which we call Torah, also have their own name called Chumash.
Okay, so it's interchangeable terms.
Yeah, you could interchange Chumash and Torah. I mean, sort of enough. And they don't mean the same thing, but they're both a reference to the 5 books. The 5 books are called the 5 Chumashim. Chumashim, the im at the end makes it plural. Each one's a Chumash. The book, I think the best way to explain it is like that book will be called a Chumash. Like, I have plenty. This is in front. Let's pretend this was the book. This is called the Chumash, the book. Torah, the body of knowledge, God's will and wisdom. Torah is from the word instruction, because all of God's will and wisdom is to instruct us how we are supposed to lead godly lives, how we can come close to God. And as we study his Torah, his instruction, we can become more and more godlike and more close to God through absorbing God's will and wisdom. So the body of knowledge is called Torah. The book that the 5 books are contained in is called a Chumash. Not what you would read in synagogue. The scroll is called a book of Torah. But on a bookshelf in someone's house, like I have many in my house, it's called a Chumash.
Okay. So it doesn't necessarily include any extra commentary, but it can?
It can and it cannot, exactly. You could have a Chumash.
Okay.
I guess you could have a Chumash without any commentary. Most Chumashes have 2 foundational commentaries, at least. The most minuscule would have Rashi, who's the most foundational commentary on the Chumash, on Torah, and on Talmud. And most also have on the side an Aramaic translation written by a convert named Onkelos. He was a nephew of the Caesar. He converted to Judaism, And he wrote, I mean, he was a very, very great, holy, righteous, godly person. And he translated the Torah to the language of the times, which was Aramaic. So almost any Chumash probably has those two things, but doesn't have to. It could just have literally the scriptures, and it's called a Chumash as well.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay. I'm just going to finish this piece right now because I know it's a little bit late, but well, you know what, I'm not. It's going to take a little bit long. So fine, I'm going to stop here. I thought like I'll just finish out like a paragraph, but I really have a lot more. So I'm going to stop here. And to be continued, not next week. Next week is the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is the saddest day on our calendar. It's a day we mourn for all destruction that's ever occurred to us since the beginning of time until now. It's officially the day both temples were burnt. The first temple and the second temple were burnt on the same day of the Hebrew calendar, the 9th of Av, hundreds of years apart by two different rulers, but both very, very devastating. And any other tragedy that ever happens to us, we always attribute to the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is the day the expulsion from Spain occurred. The Jews were expelled from Spain. It happened to be on the 9th of Av. It's the day World War I broke out, and World War II is a direct follow-up from World War I. So that was a tremendous, tremendous tragedy for us, obviously, and for the world. That began on the 9th of Av. And it's a day of all pain, all sorrow is smacked into the 9th of Av. So as such, this is such a sad day, we're not allowed to learn regular Torah. We're only basically allowed to learn about the destruction. So that's the 9th of Av. So that's next week. So I will not be able to give a class. We will not have a class next week. It's a day, it's an intense fast for us. It begins the night before. It's not only a fast, it's like I fast generally easily, but it's a hard day because it's a very sad, heavy day. You feel the pain. It's a very pain-laden day. There's lots of other things we can't do besides eat or drink, just to, again, it has sort of the same rules as Yom Kippur. We can't wash, can't wear leather, all of those things, but Yom Kippur is a very different energy. Yom Kippur is a very, very, very holy day. You're like the angel, so you're so high, who needs any of this stuff? Be in synagogue all day, pray to God, say psalms, and know you're creating an amazing year for yourself. The 9th of Av has very similar laws to Yom Kippur, but it's the other end of the spectrum. It's like the saddest day. It's like you're so below food, drink, washing, taking care of yourself. It's all like, it's just very, 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 very painful day. And to that degree, we can't really, I mean, some parts of Torah you can learn, some parts of the day, there's laws, of course, determining it all. But that's the 9th of Av. So it wouldn't obviously be a day that you need to fast at all, but it could be a day you introspect and think of the pain and the sorrow that's happened over the generations, how people have suffered, and of course what you can do about it, which is of course the takeaway from everything is how you can be a better person and make this world a better place. So that's next week. 2 weeks from now, I will also not be able to give the class for good reasons. My son, we're past the sadness, we're a week later. My son had written in his Chabad house that he has in Springfield, Illinois, Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, which we're dedicating in honor of my father-in-law, who passed away suddenly a few years ago. So I will be in Springfield. I mean, obviously you could do Zoom anywhere, but it'll be the dedication. And either be the dedication, it'll be right after, or I'll be on the road already back to Chicago. So whatever the situation is, I won't be able to give the class. So that's 2 weeks in a row. So in 3 weeks from today, and Danielle will remind everyone, so you don't have to remember this, we will continue and give you such an amazing foundational knowledge that you will know more than most Jews know about any of these topics, including Orthodox ones, because people don't necessarily know all of the development of rabbinic literature, but I felt, well, if that's Christelle's question, let's explain it.
Yeah, so I learned a lot. Thank you so much. It was very interesting, very interesting. Thank you.
I'm sure you can play it for James and he would also appreciate it.
Yeah.
Any questions on any of it? Any more questions before we conclude?
No, but that was
Shavua Tov.
that was an awesome like breakdown of all of it. I definitely understand like just the time frame everything came into be, and a much better idea of like just how to use the books.
Exactly. And we're in the middle. To be continued in 3 weeks.
Thank you so
Have
much.
a wonderful
Thank
time.
you.
Enjoy
You
the
too.
next weeks and use them well to serve God and grow closer to
Amen.
Him.
Baruch
Thank
Hashem.
you.
Bye.
Be
Thank
well.
you.
Bye-bye.